Hi everyone, thanks for coming to my talk, especially you, Kim. Even though Kim didn't do a plug for my talk and his talk. So we'll get started. My name's Owen. You've probably seen me floating around the event, coordinating lots of other people's talks and making sure microphones are working and that type of thing. So I probably haven't spent as much time preparing my own talk as ensuring other people are doing the same. So this quote was pulled from the Drupal Governance Task Force paper that was released a couple of weeks ago through the Drupal Association, and this caught my eye in terms of saying that a strong community is Drupal's main competitive advantage. You do hear of a lot of clients will choose Drupal because of the strength of the community. So what this talk is about is a little bit about where we've been. Who's been using Drupal for more than a year here? Keep your hands up. And keep your hands up if it's more than 5 years. And keep your hands up if it's more than 10 years. Okay, so what I'll probably do is cover some ground that you might be familiar with, but for the sake of people that are new to the community, there's a few myths and legends that we like to tell ourselves just to keep those stories going. I am going to look at where we are as a community in terms of our size and the types of things that we're doing. And then the core of the talk is about where can we go in the next 10 years. This is the 10th anniversary of DrupalSouth in various incarnations, and how can we keep this event going over the next decade. So the first little myth is that this kid in a sombrero in his dorm room built a message board and it became Drupal. So this is Dries Bertat, who was a 22-year-old in Belgium. Just fiddling around with some software, released it onto the internet, and before you knew it, we're now 18 years old. Drupal's now almost old enough to vote. So this is a release timeline of Drupal, and you can see it was released as an open source project back in 2001. It started getting some traction around 2003. You might remember a failed presidential candidate called Howard Dean in America used it. And that really kind of gained a lot of attention. But you can see that we kind of ticked through Drupal version 4 and 5, and it was really only when we hit Drupal 6 that it really started to get some traction. So this is what I could find as the evidence of Australia's first Drupal meetup back in 2006, run by Gordon. Just putting it out there, does anyone else use Drupal? Shall we get together? Shall we talk about it? And that's the kind of essence of our community. So in 2008, Drupal 6 was released, and it was really the trigger for Drupal to go mainstream. And at the time, most of the open source competitors were things like WordPress, Joomla and Plone. And even myself, at that point in time, I was thinking, I want to build a website, what should I use? And they were all the platforms that were springing to mind. And around that same time, Bevan Rudge over in NZ put together the first DrupalSouth. I think they had about 50 people, and it kind of had a few fits and starts as an event over the next couple of years. But what we saw with Drupal 6 was that a lot of major brands, recognised names, started using Drupal, and that just gave us a lot of credibility in terms of going to other clients like these and saying, hey, well, MTV are using it, you should probably think about using it as well. And around that time, there was lots of little companies, people like Previous Next and Catalyst. Catalyst were a bit bigger, but most of these companies were generally two-person companies that kind of saw a little opportunity emerging, and taking cues from what was happening in the US in particular around the types of clients that were going to be starting to use Drupal. And that was really the trigger for us to be able to start offering Drupal-specific services to clients. And yes, we can. Obama adopted Drupal in 2009, and that was really the kind of firework that got Drupal significant credibility with major organisations. And one of the stories that Dries has told is hanging around at DrupalCon, I think it was in DC, and a couple of guys in suits come and tap him on the shoulder and say, would you mind coming to the White House just for a quick meeting? And of course he can't turn that invitation down. He turns up at the White House and they say, we're building our website with Drupal and we thought you might be able to help us out a little bit. So it's those moments that really kind of catapult a technology in terms of adoption. And what we saw with Drupal 6 was we've kind of got its release down here in 2008, and over the next 2 to 3 years, it just catapulted from a few tens of thousands of sites running it to hundreds of thousands of sites. So that really was accelerated. Again, this is a terrible bitty graphic, but this line here represents Drupal 7. So Drupal 6 kind of got all this attention, and then Drupal 7 was released, quite a more robust platform with a lot more functionality, and it took Drupal above that magic million mark in terms of the number of sites running it. And around the time of Drupal 7 being released, we had DrupalCon Sydney, and that was an event that the Drupal Association themselves backed as being the first DrupalCon that was held outside Europe and North America. And we had 450 attendees, about 20% of those were international people coming to speak and attend and check out what was happening down here. So really a kind of high point in terms of Drupal being validated as something that was a real community in this region. Now this is a slide I had in my talk last year. I gave a bit of a controversial have we reached peak Drupal talk at Auckland last year. And what you can see here is we had Drupal 8 released in July 2015, and we see this big plateau in terms of all Drupal site usage. And you can see in recent years we've had this little dip back down, so we're kind of heading back towards that million mark. So why did this happen? Why did we have this kind of pause? And there's a lot of reasons for it. I think the first one is that we had this big pause between Drupal 7 still being out in the market, doing quite a good job with a lot of quite complex sites. A new software platform gets released. There's no really compelling reason to upgrade without having to rebuild your whole site. And so you had a lot of clients saying, well, we're not going to rebuild our site just for the sake of it, and we're going to wait until we're confident that Drupal 8 can do what we did. In the meantime, Drupal 8 was a much more robust platform, more geared towards developers that had more traditional development experience, and we did see a bit of a drop-off in terms of the types of developers that were using Drupal. So there was definitely attrition from Drupal back to things like WordPress because of that. So where does that leave us? So over the last few years, we've stabilised on calling ourselves DrupalSouth as our event, and we've had events in places like Wellington, Melbourne, the Gold Coast and Auckland, and we've tended to track between 150 and 300 attendees. This event is the biggest one that we've run since DrupalCon Sydney, so it's a great sign that we've got a lot of interest back in the community there. In the meantime, we've got meetups running around the country, and I've been trawling the internet to try and find some stats. There's about 2,500 people registered through meetup.com for the Australian and New Zealand meetups, and there's semi-regular meetups in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Gold Coast, Hobart, Canberra, Perth, Auckland and Wellington. So that's pretty good coverage across this region, and if you haven't been attending meetups or would like to kind of get more involved with those, just go to meetup.com and have a look for the next event in your area, and you'll be able to get involved in those. Looking at groups.drupal.org/Australia, and also in New Zealand, there's about 1,800 people who are registered on these sites, and these tend to be channels that we can just kind of push general information out about events and things that are happening in the community. There's also a dedicated Drupal Australia New Zealand Slack channel. Unfortunately, I don't have the link to do that, but it's relatively easy to find if you just Google how do I join the Drupal Australia Slack channel. And there's quite a lot of people now involved in there, just having continuous discussions about what they're up to. And the interesting thing about Drupal is that we kind of forget that we're part of Asia Pacific a lot of the time. I know there's a few people here from that region. And there's about 4,000 people that I could tell across countries like India and Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, those types of places. So all in all, we've actually got quite a few thousand people who are involved in the community. Now, the interesting thing is that the types of services companies that are now offering Drupal services, they're pretty big. I think Accenture's got about 400,000 staff. Deloitte's probably similar. So I think the important point about this is that with the attention of the major system integrators, the major consulting firms, Drupal's legitimacy is now at its pinnacle in terms of software adoption. So these types of companies are going to their clients and they're saying, we should be using Drupal on your projects. So that really puts us in a different ball game. In terms of a total guesstimate of the amount of work that's going through Drupal in Australia, my gut feel with a semi-educated guess is that it's well over $100 million of Drupal services work is going through companies in Australia alone. And that's going to be increasing in terms of the types of clients that are adopting it, the long-term managed services contracts that come with that. So that's significant, and that's why they're interested in it. In terms of the types of employers that are employing people with Drupal skills, there's at least 70 companies on LinkedIn that have people with Drupal skills that are working for them, which is indicative that they're probably using Drupal to some degree themselves, and they're major household names. And if we look at the people who are listing Drupal as a skill on LinkedIn, there's 7,500 people list Drupal as a skill between Australia and New Zealand. And in comparison, that's almost double the people that are listing Sitecore as a skill, but obviously much lower than WordPress. And you can see from the general site usage statistics, WordPress has still got about 30% market share. Government, I don't need to dwell on that. Lots of government is using it. I think there would be at least 500 plus sites in Australia alone running Drupal for government. And if we look at our events that are happening at the moment, the Gov CMS Mega Meetup alone last year had more than 400 attendees. We've had Drupal Gov conferences in Canberra previously with at least 200. And like I said, this is the highest attendance that we've had at the DrupalSouth since Drupalcon Sydney. And who are we competing against? I think I won't dwell on this too much, but Drupal is in that enterprise content management zone. And we're competing head-to-head with platforms like Adobe Experience Manager and Sitecore. WordPress obviously still has a huge market share, primarily in smaller sites, but they are starting to get traction in larger sites as well, so we need to be paying attention to the types of things that we're doing. And I know Vladimir did a good talk on how WordPress is different to Drupal today. And then you've got independent players like Squiz, who, despite having probably had some effects of Drupal eating into their market share, are still growing as a company. They've got 500 employees around the world building sites on their platform. And in terms of Drupal in the top 10,000 sites, this is a pretty important stat, that Drupal is running 8% of those top 10,000 sites. You can see WordPress is around 30%. And if you're looking at things like Adobe Experience Manager, they're about 5%, Sitecore 1.4%. And I think one of the things that we need to consider is that we're shifting from this notion of content management to this notion of digital experience management. So I think the takeaway is, despite having reached peak Drupal, possibly in terms of the numbers of sites running it, Drupal is definitely strong. So there's lots of clients using it, there's lots of available jobs, there's lots of big players entering the market, and that just gives us even more legitimacy in terms of knowing we've got safe jobs being Drupal people. But we've got a bit of a problem. So Drupal's a little bit middle-aged. So if you were 25 when Drupal 6 came out, you're now 35. I was 35 then, I'm now 45, and even Dries just turned 40. So in those 10 years, you might have got married, you might have young kids, you might need more secure income, and you might be a bit more career risk averse. You're not going to go off and take a punt on that startup that's offering equity instead of salary. And it makes it hard to commit to community activities because of that. So you've probably got less time to commit code to the project. You don't have that time to go and attend that meetup on a monthly basis, unless your company allocates time for you to do that. And there's a bit of perception that, hey, isn't Drupal just for building government websites? So there's a bit of a perception issue there. So if you're a young, cool developer, that tech hype is elsewhere. People do look like this. And I think the classic scenario is that there's low barriers to entry to certain technologies. So even my own experience, I'm not a developer, but I learnt enough HTML to be dangerous. I learned a bit of CSS, etc. And that tends to be the typical path into a lot of technologies. Learn a bit of HTML5, do a bit of JavaScript, progress to a bit of Node.js, spin up a WordPress site in the background, build your own static site generator, and get a job in a startup. And the types of technologies, as we heard Charbel talk about this morning, they're all the hip things like mobile apps and AI and VR, where CMS technology is almost viewed as that underlying legacy infrastructure that you just have to deal with while you're doing all the cool stuff on top of it. And Drupal 8, it's a complex platform. It's got many barriers to entry in terms of skill sets and experience. And like I said before, there's definitely been this move by some Drupal 7 developers away from Drupal 8 because it all just became a bit too much. The other aspect to Drupal is that if you're an individual developer kind of building sites for your local small businesses and that type of thing, Drupal really isn't the fit that you're looking for these days. Primarily because the types of sites that Drupal is ideally suited for require multiple skill sets. So you've got front-end devs, back-end devs, sysops, UX designers, etc. So it's much more suited to those larger teams and those larger types of sites. So that just makes it much harder for novices to jump straight into Drupal and think, hey, yeah, I can get started with this. So it's a double-edged sword, whereby Drupal is viewed as serious technology by the enterprise space, but that makes it much harder to feed people into our Drupal community because of those perceived barriers to entry. And if you look at the kind of classic technology maturity cycle, Drupal, with 18 years of development behind it, is way at the top of that curve. And I think that's very attractive to big organisations who are looking to use it. They can see that release cycle and history and be quite confident that that's going to continue. Now the good thing is that Drupal is always evolving, and it's unlikely that we're going to kind of hit that peak of the maturity curve because we're able to reinvent ourselves all the time. And that's the beauty of why we kind of stay interested in Drupal, is that it will adopt new trends like API-driven development, headless Drupal, those types of things that mean that Drupal can still play a very relevant role in a multi-device distributed web service world. And Drupal 9 already has a roadmap. Okay, we've got a release date slated for sometime in 2020, and then a very clear release schedule following that. So we don't need to worry about Drupal not being relevant anytime. So where can we go as a community, and how can you help? So this is a classic photo. I think it was, anyone know where that one? Portland. So I think one of the things that draws us to Drupal is that it is quite a diverse community compared to a lot of other technologies, and more diverse voices create a stronger community. I think we can probably give ourselves a bit of a B- in terms of our ability to make ourselves more diverse as a community. So we still need more women in the community, more people from non-English speaking backgrounds, and like I talked about, how do we bring those younger developers into Drupal? I think we're doing okay in some respects. So the attendance for this event, I think, is around 25-30% women attending, but we'd like to see that come up to 50%. And we're definitely better than many other tech communities in some regards. The community in Asia is growing steadily and very enthusiastically, so I think the difference with somewhere like India is that it is very attractive to younger developers, and they can see Drupal as being a very robust career pathway for them. And I think Drupal South has always been our regional event, but it might be advantageous for us to start thinking outside our boundaries, which we've been doing at this event, talking to people from Singapore, talking from people from India, to see how we can have more interaction with our broader regional community rather than just being totally inwardly focused. And this coincides with a big push by the Drupal Association that governs the Drupal project to increase diversity. And this is through things like subsidised attendance at events like this, encouraging new speakers to come into the community, first-time speakers, those types of things. And they're all things that we should be looking to adopt in various ways. And what's happening with DrupalCon itself? So they're the flagship events in North America and Europe. And they have made some big changes in the last couple of years. So the first thing is they've changed the format a little bit for Seattle. So while we've still got core dev tracks, they've created specific tracks for digital marketers and digital agencies to attend. And one of the other big changes is in DrupalCon Amsterdam. It's going to be coordinated by a commercial event manager. And the idea being is that frees up the Drupal Association to focus on community initiatives and content, as opposed to have we printed the right badges and does someone have a dongle for their laptop when they're speaking. So that's something that we agreed today in the BOF at lunch that we're going to look at implementing for future Drupal Souths. Not taking away from any community aspect, but ensuring that the people who are in the community volunteering their time are focusing on the core things of supporting speakers and ensuring great content, as opposed to printing badges and refunding people's tickets if they need a refund. As I said, diversity initiatives are a core focus for DrupalCon, and we're definitely looking at what's happening with DrupalCon internationally as some benchmarks for what we can be doing locally. And what does that mean for Drupal South in terms of governance? So Drupal South has been managed by a totally ad hoc group of volunteers over the past 10 years. And the classic scenario that we've had in previous years is, oh crap, we just finished a Drupal South, who's doing the next one? And it usually falls to the person that sticks their hand up and says, yes, I've got 6 months of my life to commit to running the event. And is that sustainable? And in the best interest of the event? Probably not. But we do have this classic do-ocracy model. If you are interested in being involved, you turn up and you volunteer to do something, and you're part of the group. So the other aspect is that we've had a bit of an informal council of elders or ghosts of Drupal South past who have been able to pass on their advice and mentoring to new organisers. But we want to formalise that in a more robust way. So one of the things that we did this year that you might have been aware of is that we had a more formal process for people to nominate where the next Drupal South events would be, and a committee that was reviewing those proposals and identifying what was the best fit, and we'll be announcing that at the end of the day. But all of that was still entirely volunteer driven, and again is probably not very sustainable. Now, what many of you might not be aware is that through all of this, Linux Australia has been supporting us. So the interesting thing with the Drupal Association is that their focus and mandate is not to necessarily support events like this. Their focus is on DrupalCon and keeping Drupal.org running. And so while they have given us some assistance in the past to varying degrees, it's not their mandate. And a few years ago, thanks to Donna Benjamin, who many of you know, she initiated an alliance with Linux Australia to provide us with the nuts and bolts of being able to run these events with things like event insurance and bank accounts to receive funds through and other financial tools to be able to run these events. And Linux Australia is very well placed to do that. They support things like PyCon, Laracon, GovHack, WordCamp, and so they've got those processes and structures in place to support us, and they're here. They have legal entities in Australia and New Zealand. And the other benefit to us of having that alliance is that there's opportunities for cross-collaboration with those other open source communities. So what we've been talking about over the last few weeks and have cemented at this event in the BOF that we had yesterday is that rather than Drupal South be a event-based team that is renewed afresh every time that we've got a new venue, we're putting in place a permanent Drupal South what's called a standing subcommittee that sits underneath Linux Australia. And the people on that committee, there'll be a call for nominations early next year, and the people that are voted onto that committee will have roughly 2-year rolling terms. So we've structured it in a way so that not everyone loses their term at the same time, but overall there'll be a 2-year term for those people to be across a number of events, both Drupal South, but also supporting things like Drupal Camps. We've got a Drupal camp in Byron Bay in April next year, and then other community initiatives. So can we consolidate things like training and corporate outreach and those types of things. So if you are interested in that type of governance model, we'll be putting the call for nominations out early next year, going through a bit of a voting process that follows the Drupal Association's guidelines for doing that, and then that committee will be in place through 2019, 2020 and 2021, overseeing those events. In the meantime, the people that are actually organising Drupal South, they'll just be an event committee and they'll have the full support of that standing subcommittee, so we have that consistency and knowledge transfer there. So one of the other things that we'd be looking at doing through that standing committee is what are the pathways that we can be getting people into the community through. So Drupal training is a big one, and again Vladimir has kind of been the flag bearer for running independent Drupal training, but there's a number of other organisations that do provide training, and how can we most effectively capture that, put it out into the broader community, and use that as a pathway for people to come into the Drupal community as members and developers and that type of thing. Drupal is also used by many of Australian and New Zealand universities, and are there alliances that we can put in place with those organisations, again to drive training through partnerships with them. And then Drupal meetups and camps, as I mentioned. Once we have that standing committee in place, any profit that we're making from Drupal South would then be there to be able to support those events that might be non-profit or no profit or negative profit. So it's definitely a model that will be able to sustain things that are purely community-driven events. So how can you help with this? If you are interested in being a Drupal trainer itself, there's a lot of people with a lot of experience in this room. We'll be looking at avenues of how you could get involved in being a trainer and how you might be able to earn some extra money on the side by doing so. And if you work for a big Drupal team, talk to your colleagues about the possibility of starting to establish things like Drupal internship programs. So if you're a young developer, you've got no experience, how do you get that experience? Well, being an intern is one pathway that might be applicable, and there's definitely larger organisations that have the staff to support that type of thing. And then finally, getting involved with your local meetups. Like I said, Google where your local meetup is, offer yourself up as a potential speaker. That's the biggest thing that drives meetup attendance, is having pre-scheduled speakers well in advance, or just a volunteer. Do they need someone to go and pick up the pizzas? And then the other major area is large organisation engagement. So I think the classic scenario of someone using Drupal in a large organisation, and this is definitely not indicative of everyone, but it's just the thing you use when you turn up at work and probably get annoyed with, either as a content editor or even a developer. And in many organisations that we deal with, they might be using Drupal, but they've got no idea that there's a community behind it, and a very small understanding or limited understanding of what it means to be an open source project. And we've got so many large organisations using Drupal now, so there's a big opportunity there to drive more engagement with those large users, and have them involved in the community from an event perspective, and then also involved from a code contribution perspective. And Kim, if you want to, if you didn't see his talk yesterday, have a look at it when it's published online. He goes through some very specific examples of how larger organisations can adopt specific strategies around code contribution that drives better employee engagement, better training, all of those types of benefits that come from being involved. So how can you help in this regard? Again, talk to your colleagues about ways that you might be able to get involved with the community if you are working for a large organisation, and talk to your managers about a more formalised approach to co-contribution. It might just be a one-paragraph statement that you draft and adopt that says, if we're modifying a Drupal, we will commit that code back to Drupal.org. So there's many very simple ways that you can get involved at that level. And then event attendance and sponsorship. So I know many organisations have a limit on how many people can go to an event and how much money they can spend on things like sponsorship. But when an event that runs for 2 days is $100 with an early bird ticket, it's incredibly cheap for such a professional event to get involved with. And just talking about co-contribution, Kim went into this in quite a lot of detail in his talk yesterday, but Drupal.org provides a ranking system for Drupal contribution through tracking how many issues a organisation has committed in a specific month. Now, looking through the top 125 global contributors, only 3 of those companies are Australian or New Zealand based, and you have to go down to the top 250 to find another 4 Australian organisations in this list. This is on Drupal.org/Drupal services. And of those other 4 in the top 250, 3 of them are one-person companies. And I'm not going to name and shame or anything like that, but I think the numbers speak for themselves in terms of we could be doing a whole lot better as agencies and organisations in terms of our co-contribution. And co-contribution can be easily factored into your employees' time. So we have a policy at Previous Next of if you're 80% billable, that rest of that 20% of your available time can be directed towards co-contribution. There may be other models that are more applicable to your own organisation. But again, it just needs to be a one-paragraph policy of if you have free time, you can contribute code. And the other interesting thing about this system is that clients themselves can get credits for code contributions. So all of the clients that we work with and any modules that we modify on projects that we're working on for their benefit get contributed back to Drupal.org, and those clients get a credit for it. So if you look for Service New South Wales on Drupal.org, you can see all the modules that they've essentially paid for to be contributed back and getting recognition from the community for doing so. Now, I know the Gov CMS have been driving initiatives in this regard around their platform and products, and that's a great way for people working in government to have more awareness of that. And so getting to the end, where are we heading for the immediate future of Drupal South? So through the venue selection process that we had last year, we've actually chosen the next 2 years of venues. We're going to be announcing 2019 after the keynote today, and that just provides a lot of strong continuity for us in tandem with us establishing that standing committee within Linux Australia, and it's going to be supplemented by regional and specialised camps. So we've got Drupal Camp Byron Bay, but there's opportunities for us to start looking at other camps that address specific industry verticals. So like I said, there's huge use of Drupal in higher education, so why don't we just do a one-day higher ed camp for Drupal around that vertical? And we do have a goal to start driving the numbers for Drupal South. We've kind of been a bit up and down in terms of growth for numbers, but I think it's a good goal for us to have steady growth of the event over time. Drupal South will always be our flagship event in the region. It's essentially our own DrupalCon, and we'd like to see those numbers grow. So how can you help with that? Each location will have calls for volunteers to help with myriad aspects of event organisation, and that might be things like sponsorship management, speaker selection and management, some graphic design for the website, content authoring for the website, and the events will only be as good as the amount of diversity of involvement that we get from the community. So I saw a tweet today saying something like, oh, all this talk about UX at the conference and look how crap the event website looks. Well, if you're pissed off about that stuff, put your hand up to help. Okay, there's no point just kind of complaining when you're in a position to actually do something about it. And bearing in mind that all of that work has been done by volunteers, and you can only do so much in certain aspects of the event when it's the time in between getting your kids from school and that type of thing. And don't expect that the event will be successful without your involvement. It does require you to be actively talking to your colleagues, to your immediate community, to drive involvement with these events. And finally, where are we going to be in 2028? So we're all going to be much older, including Dries. Dries will be 50 and he'll have grey spiky hair. But like I said, Drupal 9, we've got a release date for that for 2020 now. So by 2028, I expect we're probably on Drupal 11 by then. And the important thing to consider is that most large organisations who make technology decisions around something like Drupal, they're making those investments for 5 or 10 year periods. So Drupal definitely won't be going away. And I think the notion of what a website is going to continue to change over that period. So Drupal is still likely to be sitting at the core of large content publishing platforms, but there'll be myriad delivery points for that. So I'm sure when the brain-computer interface is released sometime in 2026, Drupal will be sitting at the core of that, delivering content direct to your brain. And my own hope and vision for DrupalSouth and our local community is that it'll continue to thrive. We've definitely got work to do in certain areas, and there's definitely a lot of opportunities for people to get involved to drive those initiatives. But I hope that we're here in 10 years having the same conversation about the next 10 years. So thank you for listening. We do have some time for questions or comments or criticisms. Anything like that you'd like to put forward? Amy Marie.
Yeah, so we talked about Drupal Community, but what we haven't actually talked about is a lot of the toxicity that has occurred in the community over a couple of years. The newspaper reports, the heavy trolling, etc. So when we're talking about, the thing with Drupal is it's really got, as you're saying, it's got to a point where it's corporate. So when something's corporate, you can't just automatically, think that people are going to want to engage with people at the time. You've also got to look at from a diversity perspective, because of the way that things have gone, the toxicity, you're not talking to new people. They do not want to be involved in the community. Yep. All you have to do is look up some hashtags or videos that were made. It's people in Australia were targeted in that as well. I can talk about recruiters calling me and telling me that people in person X in the Drupal community has told me that you can't do this or you can't do that. I can name agencies that have called government departments in Australia and said to them, we won't work with you if you hire person X. It's quite a couple of people that has happened to. This is a reality in the community that we actually really need to talk about and we really need to address, because pulling more people into a community when we have that toxicity there is actually probably not the best thing if we're not actually really looking at it and addressing it.
Yeah, so that's a very hard thing for me to address here. I'm not aware of the details of any personal experiences that you might have had in terms of the background of those events. What I can say is my personal experience of the Drupal community and others who work with me has not been toxic, and there have been a couple of incidents that have been very public that have caused divisions within the community, but they are not indicative of the community as a whole from my perspective. So we can definitely talk about this after my session if you want to go into it in more detail. Sally might want to follow up on her perspective on things as well. But I would like to point out that we do have very clear governance structures around issues that might evolve like that within the community, and the Drupal Association takes it very seriously, and we as event organisers also take it very seriously. So I don't want to get into the weeds of what you've just raised there in too much detail, but my own experience is very different to yours.
It's not about my personal experience or your personal experience, it's about the reality of what's happened, it's about the reality of the YouTube video.
Like I said,
to not address that and to not talk about that when we're talking about taking a community forward is it's not responsive. It's
Like I said, I'm happy to talk to you about this after my talk, but my own experience is very different to yours. Sally, do you want to add to that?
I actually agree, but I feel like it's kind of a failing of the Drupal Association to have done stuff around that. I hoped some of the stuff they were doing with governance reforms would sort of move towards it, but it's all just been very stalled and that. I would say, like, we don't have to rely on the DA to kind of do stuff within Drupal. Obviously, they have such an influence over the community, it's hard not to.
The Drupal Association, there's no problems. There's no problems with the Drupal Association. What it is the agency. It is the egos within Drupal, right, and the bigger bullies within Drupal that push people out. And this has been known for years. Come on, look at what happened when WebChip came on the first time. This has been an issue that we've been trying to address for many, many years, right? So it is a real issue, and the community is fractured at the moment. Now that's not to say, obviously we all have good experiences in the community, otherwise we wouldn't be here. I've been in this community for 11, 12 years. I remember when you first came to a Drupal meetup.
Yep.
I remember when Kim first came.
Yeah, so Amy, can we...
This is a reality, right? And we need to actually address it.
Yep.
Because when we're not addressing it, as I said, and when we do have things that are going on where there is people talking about stuff, there's been X amount of conversations at this conference alone, right?
So Amy, I'm going to have to call time on your comments. There's other people that might want to have a question or a comment around this. I'm more than happy to have a talk to you about this afterwards. Okay, I'm not shutting you down in a public forum, but...
I finished what I had to say. So
yeah,
that's fine.
okay. Anyone else like to make any comments, questions? Okay, so I'm just going to close by saying and reiterating that I do strongly disagree with Amy Marie's comments there, and I think we do have a robust community that can deal with these issues in a constructive way. Sometimes things do get messy, but they have been relatively isolated incidents from my perspective, and I think if we do have similar issues arise in our own local community, they can be dealt with in a structured way to alleviate any of the situations that you've raised there. So a bit of a sombre note to end on, but I would encourage you to look beyond what might be some perceived negatives about the community and focus on the positive things that we've achieved over the last 10 years and that we can still achieve going forward. So thank you for coming. Sally, who's up the back, is going to be giving the keynote closing at 4 o'clock, and then we'll have some drinks afterwards. Remember that the code sprint is on tomorrow. It's a great opportunity to get involved. It'll be in the BOF room downstairs and kicking off at 9 a.m. Yep, fantastic. All right, thanks everyone.